Hello, welcome to this video. Now, if you're anything like me, you've probably been stuck inside for way too long and not flying for way too long. Maybe even this is the longest time as a pilot you've not been flying for. So this video is going to be all about what should you do when you first get back in that plane. It's really aimed at PPL holders, but if you're a PPL student watching this, there's loads of really good tips you can take from this as well. So I'm going to go through the things that I found the hardest when I got back into flying after the previous lockdown, and the things I've seen my students and other PPL holders that I know and fly with. I'm going to identify some of the things they found hard as well, and we'll look at how we can solve it and how we can basically get back up to becoming a really safe pilot and really confident pilot as quickly as possible, really. So we're going to look essentially at the skills that we've lost and what we can do about them, and a few other little gotchas along the way. Now, if you haven't heard of me or seen me or watched one of my videos before, hello, welcome. My name is Finn. I'm a flight instructor. I fly around the southeast of England, and I try and make a bunch of videos to help my students when they're struggling with various different things. So if you're watching this for the first time and think, oh, I'd really like to see a video about XYZ, then check my channel. Maybe it already exists. If it doesn't, drop me a little comment below and I'll try and make it, because if you're struggling with something, maybe others are as well. So let's get cracking into this video and see what we're going to talk about. So the real aims of today's session are to brush off those cobwebs, and these are the things we're going to look at. We're going to look at the legal items that you need to check, just a refresher on that. Some things have changed. The aircraft status. If we haven't flown, most aircraft will have done little or no flying over the past however long it may be. I'm also going to look at what not flying or not doing something does to your memory and how you can improve that. We're also going to look at ways you can, and skills I think will refresh your motor skills. If you don't practice something for a long time, your motor skills are going to deteriorate, whether you like it or not. We're going to then look at other gotchas and a few other little things. So, but the real aim, the real goal of today is just to get back to some safe flying, some legal flying, of course, and just so we're not anxious or worried about it anymore, so we can just be really enjoying ourselves in general aviation. So first thing, I hate putting legal, boring, dry stuff at the start, but I'm just going to zoom through it. The first thing I want to talk about is really where you should find your guidance about what's allowed and what's not allowed for flying. You probably already know this, but really the place to look is the Department for Transport's general aviation page. If you just Google Department for Transport coronavirus general aviation, you'll find this page. At the moment I'm recording this on the 10th of February, and there's a national lockdown in place, so that means that you can't be doing any flying unless it's for commercial or engine health and maintenance check flights. A few other little exceptions here, but this is the place to come, and they're quite good at keeping this updated, despite everything changing quite frequently. When we had the tiers around, they would normally have this updated around the time it all changed. So it's really good, clear advice there. So that's where you should find that. The next legal thing I want to talk about is more sort of regulatory stuff, like your license, your rating, and your medical. So now's a good time to just double check, is this all still valid? So get out your license. There has been a change over the past few months, and that's we've left EASA. If you're holding the EASA license, don't worry, it's still valid on, if you've got a EASA license issued by the UK, that's still valid to fly G-Reg aircraft. And the UK also saying if you've got an EASA license from other countries, issued in other countries, for the time being, that's going to be fine for flying G-Reg aircraft, and they can accept it. It gets a bit more complicated outside of that, but if you've got an EASA license and you're wondering what happened with Brexit, and it's issued by the UK, and you want to fly in the UK, essentially nothing's changed. There's more to it than that, but we're not going to talk about that in this video. The other thing to check is your rating. When does your SEP rating expire if you're going to go fly an SEP aircraft? When does that expire? Just double check that. And the same for the medical. Double check that hasn't expired as well. There are some exemptions at the moment. You can find them on the CAA website. The first one I want to mention is until the end of April, and I wouldn't be surprised if they extend this a little bit. If you need to revalidate your single engine piston, or also some other ratings, but essentially the single engine piston rating, then the requirements are sort of reduced slightly as to what you have to do. There's this table here. This is the document you want to go to. It's very, very exciting. Official Record Series 1416. To be honest, just consult an instructor or an examiner is probably the best thing to do for this. But essentially, if you haven't got your 12 hours in your second year, then they're saying if you've done a bunch of landings and do more than 1 hour with an instructor, then you can get away with having done less than 12 hours. So say, for example, you've only done 8 hours of flying in the past 12 months, in the second 12 months of your single engine piston rating, but you've done at least 18 takeoff and landings, then instead of doing 1 hour with an instructor, you can revalidate with just 1.5 hours with an instructor, taking your total to 9.5 hours, and that'll be more than enough to get your SEP back for another 2 years. So yeah, this table is basically all you need to know. If you've got less than 8 hours, then either you want to go get that extra 4 hours in and a bunch of takeoffs and landings, or just do a proficiency check with an examiner, which it sounds scary, but actually I think it's worthwhile doing every now and then. The other thing is, until the 31st of March, and again, I'm recording this 10th of February, but this may be extended, but you can use a medical declaration instead of a Class 2 medical. Now, we're not going to go into the depths of that too much, but if your Class 2 runs out and you can't get an appointment, you can still fly as long as you're still fit to fly. You do have to fill in some paperwork, send off to the CAA, and declare this, that you're fit to fly. And there's more information if you look at ORS 1421. You'll see this here. I will leave it to you to read through this lovely document written by the CAA. Okay, so the other thing to remember is don't forget the 3 in 90 rule. So if you haven't flown in the last 90 days, which is probably quite unlikely, then if you want to take a passenger with you, you need 3 takeoff and landings. So this first flight you do is probably either going to be with an instructor or on your own. And that probably depends on what your club or insurance rules are. So one aircraft that I fly, the insurance just requires that you've flown in the last 90 days. And one of the clubs that I work for, they insist they've got the 28-day rule. So just double check what your club and insurance rules are as well, as to whether you can get passengers or not and what you need to be doing, and whether you need to go up with a friendly instructor. And then lastly, just before you fly, just go through and double check the aircraft documents. No one will have looked at these for probably quite a significant amount of time, and it's not uncommon for these to expire. Things that are quite common that don't get noticed and may have been renewed but haven't had a copy put in there, so which you really need to do to be nice and legal to fly, are things like the radio license, which just needs paying for by whoever pays for that. The insurance certificate might not have been replaced with a new updated one. And also, when you do look at the return to service, which tells you when the next check is, don't forget that a lot of aircraft that are flying at the moment will need checks by a calendar date because they've flown so little. So just double check not just how many hours until the next check, but when that next check is due as a calendar date, because that is something we're not used to hitting most of the time if you're lucky and your planes fly a lot, so you might not be used to looking for it. So that's the legal stuff. Now I want to talk about sort of the aircraft status, like what's happened to it, because presumably it's just been sat there lonely, doing very little. It might have had the odd little maintenance flight, might have gone to the mechanics for its annual or its check, but it's unlikely really to have flown that much, which means it will have been sat there doing very little. So when you go and do your A check, really do it really thoroughly. So give yourself a lot of time. Even if you don't normally use your checklist, I really recommend just walking around and taking your checklist with you and using it if possible. Just make sure you're doing everything really thoroughly. Have a really good look around. Some things you might want to keep your eye out for are wildlife, especially if your plane's parked outside. Has anything had a nibble of a cable anywhere, or tried to make a nest somewhere? You never know what's happened. And also fuel. Now, fuel's a really interesting one. The CAA say, and I couldn't really find much data to back this up, so you might want to speak to your mechanic, engineer or camo lovely friendly camo person. But the CAA state that avgas got about a 3-month shelf life once it's in a fuel tank, which isn't really that long. So have a real good check of it. And if you're not sure, consult someone else as well as to whether it's still good to go. And then also another one is, it's been big changes of temperature, lots of humidity around for certain parts of this winter in the UK. So double check the fuel for contamination, have a real good look at it. Double check that what you're taking out the bottom is fuel and not just perfectly clear water. So yeah, have a real good look. And then yeah, just really don't rush and don't get distracted. If you find yourself getting distracted or interrupted, my top tip is just to go back a couple of steps in your checklist and start again. Make sure you leave yourself lots of time. I would say from a personal place, most of the times, and I'm not proud of this, but I want you to hear my honest truth, and that most of the times I've put myself or others at risk is because I've rushed an A check and done silly things that if I'd not been rushing I wouldn't have, like left a cap off something or not noticed if something is missing or not there. So yeah, really take your time. Next thing I want to talk about is your memory. Now, we all know that if we don't access stuff in our long-term memory, then it's harder to get hold of. Our memory will have faded. There'll be things that maybe 6, 10, 12 months ago, you could rattle off a Frida checklist or all the V-speeds for your aircraft or whatever it might be at the drop of a hat. And now if I ask you to do it, you might find it way harder to do. So I think the best thing to go about this is just to really refresh it. Access all the stuff that you need to remember and do it in a nice, give yourself a bit of space and time to do this. So maybe the night before, what I really recommend is just by sitting down and like going through the checklist and seeing, just reminding yourself. What an even better thing to do is if you can sit in your chair and move your hands to where you'd normally go in your imaginary cockpit in your dining room to find the specific button. And just really, some people call this chair flying. It's, I think, really valuable to do because it starts to get your motor memory all connected up again. So read through your checklist the night before, make sure it's still familiar to you, and revise your important speed. So what's your rotate speed? What's VX? What's VY? What's your best glide speed? What RPM settings do you use? All these sort of things. Other things you might want to revise as well are how much fuel, what's the fuel capacity? What's the general fuel consumption? Do you have a number you use as a rule of thumb? Really just get back into these things, these numbers that you may need, especially you may need in a rush, but you haven't used for a while. So really just get your memory going back to retrieving those items from your memory. And another great thing to do, you've probably not spoken on the radio for a long time. So sit and just rehearse the air traffic control calls you're likely to make. Also, I'd really recommend going and listening to some air traffic control. If you've got a little airband receiver and you're near a little airfield, tune in, just get back used to listening to the language and hearing what other people are saying, and yourself really practice what you are likely to say on your flight as well. Get used to saying it again, because these things, you do get rusty with them, whether you like it or not. And then what I would say is spend way more time planning your flights than normal. So, and give yourself bigger buffers everywhere. So margins of error, I would say, get to the airfield an hour before you normally would. Leave yourself, if you would normally leave 200 feet and 2 miles away from controlled airspace, maybe double that, make that 4 miles and 400 feet, or even more, really. Give yourself as much buffer as you can, especially for these early flights when, even if you don't feel rusty, you may not have as much capacity as you might have done before, and you could probably get more easily overloaded than you may have done before. So really spend a lot more time than you normally would planning is one of my many bits of advice from this video. Next thing I want to talk about, and I touched on it a second ago, is your motor skills. Now, we're probably quite used to almost doing things in sort of what we sometimes call automatic. You know exactly how far, probably if you've flown your aircraft type quite a lot, you probably know exactly how much to move your hand by for a certain amount of RPM increase from the engine. So say you want 200 RPM more, you probably can almost do it right now. But as your memory fades, your motor memory also kind of fades with it. So another great thing to do is refresh these skills. And a lot of this is going to be done either the night before by doing things like going through your checklist and chair flying your flight, or when you actually get in the plane. So these are some of the things I suggest you do when you go flying. And the first thing is something you may not have done for a long time. This is a really good skill to just, it's quite a nice relaxing skill. You're not near the edge of any envelopes. Just try and fly maybe, I don't know, just give yourself 15 knots above the stall speed or something like that. Just try and fly the aircraft slowly while maintaining an altitude. And it's a really good skill for just getting back into the feel of the plane and feeling that trim and the power. And it takes lots of small adjustments, as you remember from before, to make slow flight, especially the entry to it, really work. So really give that a go. And another great one is steep turns, because it's a beautiful, beautiful exercise in coordination and holding attitudes, and I think an excellent exercise. So see if you can get back into steep turns. I'm going to mention something else about steep turns a bit later, but I think it's an excellent exercise. Stalling, go and do some stalls. Maybe keep them simple. If you can try and get higher than you normally would to give yourself a bigger margin of error. And then also, if you can, try and do a PFL. Now, I think especially when lockdown's just opening up, just be a bit wary of where you're doing, even more wary than normal, about where you're doing your PFL over. We don't want to annoy loads of people that might still be locked down, so maybe don't fly over an area and do PFLs over people that are locked down. That might just be rubbing salt in their wounds a little bit, so just be a bit wary. And again, just give yourself a bit more margin of error than you would do before. So go around a couple hundred feet higher than you normally would from a PFL. And then really recommend circuits. Go back and maybe you do this as a second flight, not included in your first flight. In fact, I'd probably recommend splitting it off into a second flight. Just have your first one, just get up there, bit of general handling, bit of flying around, looking at beautiful scenery and getting back, maybe with a PFL, some stalls, steep turns, that sort of thing. And then second flight, I really recommend just bashing the circuit. You remember from your training or post your training that this is where you can make the biggest gains in your handling skills, because busy time, and as you know, takeoff and really landing is the hardest bit. And the easiest bit to get out of practice with as well. So I recommend going and do some circuits, and also an engine failure after takeoff if you can. It's always worthwhile exercise. Don't forget your airport you operate from might have some restrictions on this. It might not be possible on all runways, but yeah, really try and cram those in so that you can regain your currency nice and quickly. Other gotchas I just want to mention from my experience in as a flight instructor, myself, having not flown for a bit and going back into it and seeing other students and other PPL holders do this, I'd say first one right now is the NOTAM situation. There's lots of closures, there's lots of extra restrictions, there's lots of air traffic controllers that aren't fully staffed or are spread thinly, and this is going to be changing all the time, and the way we find out is via NOTAM. So give them a real good look. Don't just look at the ones at your airfield either. Go and check the ones en route. If you are a PPL student, you should be looking at the AIS website for this. For everyone else, I really recommend just getting yourself on SkyDemon, and it's a really great really great way to brief yourself before it, and well worth the money. And there you go, SkyDemon free advertising. Here you go. So yeah, really, really check for that. And some other things as well, when you're flying to airports, they may have changed some procedures that you wouldn't really expect, such as the way to pay for landing fees may have changed. It might be done over the phone now or in a different location. Parking in different areas might be closed. So yeah, definitely when you ring up for PPR, get a real good briefing again, even if it's somewhere you've been hundreds of times before. If you're going to go out of the country, be aware of travel restrictions. And so, I mean, I think you're probably aware of the currently changing restrictions going from country to country at the moment. So we're not going to go into that too much, but I do want to highlight some places that you might not have thought would have some restrictions. For example, Scotland and Wales seem to be having very different rules from England. So just get yourself on those countries' web pages and see what the actual rules are there if you fancy going there. Other things you might not have thought about are the Isle of Man has got some very different restrictions and some very strict border controls, as do the Channel Islands, even though these are all sort of in the UK or part of the whatever technical part of the UK they are or aren't. They've got a lot of stricter border restrictions than we're used to, so just be a bit careful for that. And same goes for Ireland, which is now not part of the EU. And same goes for Northern Ireland as well, which has changed a little bit. So the rules around that have changed. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but just be aware that there's a lot more country restrictions, and a lot of places you would have considered part of the UK may have restrictions as well. Airspace. So quite a lot has changed in the southeast. Well, not quite a lot, but a fair bit has changed in the southeast over the past sort of year and a bit. And so just make sure you're up to speed with what they are if you haven't flown around them. I think the biggest one is the Farnborough airspace. It's quite a it's a really, really confusing bit of airspace, really poorly designed in my opinion. So before you cross it, I'd recommend maybe not crossing it on your first flight back after lockdown. If it's something you are sort of worried about, really do yourself a good briefing and have plan A, B, and C for crossing it and avoiding it. Unfortunately, avoiding it is a long haul. And also another thing I wanted to mention here is the danger areas in the channel. Now at the moment they're due to run out, I think I've got them up here, they're due to run out at the end of March, and they're only as high as 1,500 feet in most of the areas, but I have seen these NOTAMs as higher over the past year every now and then, so just keep an eye out for it. And there's French NOTAMs on the French airspace side of things as well, if you are going across to France, which hopefully if you're watching this in the future is possible. So yeah, just double check you're up to speed on changes of in airspace, and maybe just have another look at your chart as well to make sure that's up to date. If you are not sure how to check the validity of your chart, I haven't got the page up now, so I'm just going to go to the UK AIP. So if I Google UK AIP, I'll get to these kind of pages. If we go to VFR charts and publication dates, then it tells you which one is current. You can look at the chart, double check it's current, and see when the next one's out. So I'm recording this in February the 10th, and so in just under 2 months there's a new one out of the most common we use in the area I fly, the off-mill, South England and Wales. So, but just double check you have got edition 46 and not 45 from previous incarnations of that chart. Other gotchas, and this I think is what I wanted to come back to about steep turns, is when you go into your general handling, let yourself into it gently. I've noticed, and a lot of the people I fly with have noticed, that one of the other huge things to go is not just sort of your memory's not quite as sharp and your motor skills aren't quite as sharp and you're not having quite as much capacity as you did before, but also is your sort of physiological tolerances to certainly G-force, which is applicable for steep turns, maybe unusual attitudes becomes a bit harder, and turbulence as well. And this took me by surprise because I have many hours being thrown around in a light aircraft in the southeast of England, and many hours doing steep turns, stalls, spins, all this sort of thing. And actually, this was the thing I noticed the most when I came back from the lockdown in sort of from spring/summer 2020. Was I got in a plane, I went and did some steep turns. I all of a sudden didn't feel 100%. So just be aware of that. And if you start to feel unwell for whatever reason, just stop what you're doing and just fly straight and level for a bunch of time. Get some cold air on you. And this is the thing that took me by surprise the most, I think. And then if you're not sure where to go for more information, or where I've got some of this information from, as I said, the Department for Transport GA page has got all of the legal information to stay within the coronavirus rules you need. The CAA COVID portals, quite a lot of complicated documents on there. But if you do want to make use of either of those exemptions, then that's a place to go, and I wouldn't be surprised if actually they add some extra things in the future. And then there's this GASCO course. So this is General Aviation Safety Council, I think it stands for. If you head over here, there's a little course you can do which really focuses on human factors, which I think is quite interesting, which you can start, and some video presentations. It's a bit of a robotic voice. I wish they'd personalised that a bit more, but other than that, I think it's a really good little course just for refreshing your memory on what may not be going quite to plan, really. So my final tips really are keep your workload like as low as you can, really. Make your goals achievable. Don't go out there in a 30-knot crosswind on a really turbulent day, on a really short strip after a big long rainfall when you haven't flown for ages. Just really be sensible. Set your normal limits a bit lower. So if you normally go out when the clouds are, I don't know, at a certain level, then maybe consider if you need a bit more airspace around you. And the same what I was saying earlier about keeping a bit more space from airspace. So keep your workload low. Give yourself time. Give yourself a bunch of time to do what you need to do. Get to the club early. Make sure that you've got nothing requiring you to be somewhere immediately afterwards. You've got a bit of buffer time either way. And give yourself space as well. So we're all going to be really looking forward to chatting about aviation and chatting shop. Really just try and give yourself a bit of space away from people as well so you can focus on your flight. Reduce those outside influences that are going to stress you out as much as possible. And finally, enjoy yourself. I'm really looking forward to the time when we all get back in the air, back current and back flying safely. So look, thanks for watching this video. If you've got any questions, comments, whatever, put them in the box down below or email me. My email address is flywithfinn@gmail.com, and enjoy your post-coronavirus lockdown flying.